Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the August ERM Toolbox Training webinar. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. If you've dialed in by phone but haven't joined us by web and you would like to see the slides that will be displayed during the webinar, please point your web browser to readytalk.com. In the box where it says Join a Meeting, enter the same access code that you used to join the call, 987-9821. Please stay aware of the level of background noise in your area, and if it starts to get noisy, please put your phone on mute. If you are called away from your phone, please do not put it on hold, as that will cause your hold music to be transmitted to everybody else. You can simply hang up and dial back in, and it will not disrupt the call. We are leaving the phone lines open, so if you have questions, you can ask them as they come up. Also, the chat feature in the box should be in the lower left corner of your screen and is available for typing in questions that way. With that, allow me to introduce the presenter today. Lisanne Cison is the practice lead for Bickmore's Enterprise Risk Management practice and has been involved with the UC's ERM program since 2006. In addition to providing general support to the UC ERM program, she's acted as the project lead for the Retrospective Review Automation Project, better known as UC Action, and is currently working to adapt the system to support other ERM activities. Lisanne?
Good morning, Emily, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for the introduction. I hope you're all having a wonderful week so far. Just wanted to thank you all for attending the August ERM Toolbox webinar. And today we're going to be discussing some of the common risks to higher education. And one of the things that we did to kind of get a handle on what the impact and likelihood are and really identifying what are those common risks to higher education. And so our agenda today is to talk first of all about what are system-wide risk assessments and how can they be used to support different initiatives. We're also going to talk specifically about the approach that we used to identify common risks to higher education and how we used this information to poll some of the Vice Chancellors of Administration to get their perspective on these various risks and how we used that to drive what our mitigations were. And I'd also like to kind of open up the discussion to folks to see whether you were involved in this process and what your experiences were and whether you have suggestions on how we may be able to adapt this process in the future. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into an overview of system-wide risk assessments. So there's a lot of different ways to do a system-wide risk assessment. You can have a narrow system-wide risk assessment. So one example of that is the Hazard Vulnerability Risk Assessment that we did in 2005 at Risk Services. And this risk assessment focused on natural disasters and human-related events, including technology or terrorism or other acts by people. That one was narrow because it was very specific to certain folks completing this risk assessment as well as the risk topics. In terms of a broad risk assessment, this one for the Vice Chancellors of Administration risk assessment that we did towards the end of last year, it looked at a lot of different types of risk, not just hazard risk. One thing that I'd like you to keep in mind in terms of risk assessments is that they can be both broad and narrow, but they can also be deep and shallow. So for example, a lot of times you may have a risk assessment for a very specific type of risk. Let's say, for example, fire safety. You may have a 100-question survey, so it's very deep and detailed in terms of the types of risks that are involved and the types of people that you may speak to, but it's very narrow in focus. On the other side, you may have a broad list of risks that touch on lots of different categories like information technology or reputational risk or human capital risk. But you may only include a few people in that assessment. And so it gives you a broader view of the risk but a very narrow group of people that are involved in it. The one thing that I do want to emphasize is that there's no one way to do a system-wide risk assessment. In fact, it's very beneficial if a lot of different people are doing enterprise-wide view risk assessments. So environmental health and safety may do a certain type of risk assessment across the entire system. Ethics and compliance may be doing system-wide risk assessments. The CFO division may be doing them, as well as risk services. And then each of those different divisions would use the results of that assessment to guide their various initiatives. But the purpose of the call today is to describe the approach we used for a very specific system-wide risk assessment. So what we had to do first is we had to identify what were common risks that were faced by higher education institutions. And so what we did is we performed a search for risk assessment results or risk discussions that were publicly available and searchable on the web. And we not only looked at our own, or the University of California's risk assessments, but we also looked at other universities. So for example, UNLV, University of Las Vegas, Nevada, University of Illinois. We also looked at professional organizations like the Association of College and University Auditors to get an idea of what type of risks that they were looking on or looking at. And we compared those lists of risks and found what were some of the common hitters, or the common denominators. And we generated a list of about 40 risks and separated them by category. So these are the different categories that we came up with. So there's hazard, financial, information technology risks, human resources or human capital risks, research risks, contract and grant risks, student life risks, and facilities and maintenance risks. The one thing that I want to emphasize is we were taking this risk assessment approach from a campus view and not necessarily a medical center view. We may take a look at this and revisit this from a medical center perspective, but for this particular risk assessment, we were only looking at it from the campus perspective. So the results of this risk assessment were documented in Bulletin number 11, which is available on the ERM website. And it looks like this. So you can see some of the examples in the risk category for hazard. I know the type is really small, but it includes domestic terrorism, pandemic, laboratory safety, and other things along those lines. So it's one thing to identify what some common risks are in higher education, but it's an entirely different thing to assess them in terms of what their impact and their likelihood are and what we're actually doing to manage and mitigate these risks. And this really comes out with a prioritized view of what our risks are. So what we did is we took this list of 44 different risks and we asked the Vice Chancellors of Administration to estimate what their perspective is in terms of the impact and likelihood of these risks occurring, as well as assess the overall effectiveness of our current controls for those risks. And the idea is that we can get, because of where the Vice Chancellors of Administration sit within the organization, they're in a unique position to be able to see all the different risks that were identified as part of this study. And so rather than casting a huge net and trying to get a lot of different people's perspectives, we wanted to get a select group of people's perspectives on a wide group of risks. And what we would like to do is take that information to help steer what the ERM team and panel is doing to help the campuses deal with those activities and deal with those risks. So the scope of this survey varied at each of the different locations. And so we sent out a survey to each of the different Vice Chancellors of Administration. And some of them really just worked within their own department to identify what the impact, likelihood, and current control effectiveness were for this predetermined list of common risks. And so some of them just looked at their own department. Some of them reached out to their colleagues in different departments across campus to provide input. In addition, the approach of this survey also varied. So for example, at UC Santa Barbara, I believe that they used a group setting where everybody got together and talked about these risks. And then others gathered information more at a department level using a department-specific risk assessment like UCLA and UC Riverside did. Do we have any folks from Santa Barbara, UCLA, or UC Riverside on the call?
UCLA Medical Center, Louise Underdahl.
Hello, how are you?
Oh, always interesting to hear presentations.
Well, thank you. So unfortunately, I don't think that the medical centers were looped in at this point in time.
Oh well, I'm just here, stealthily learning. But maybe Dean or one of his people will be able to tune in, or maybe I can share the information with them.
There we go. We'll make sure to keep that communication loop going. So I was just trying to get an idea of whether anybody was involved with this risk assessment and see whether they had any insights on their experience or not. But it doesn't sound like it is. So we're just going to go ahead and dive into the results at this point in time. So what we did is once we collected the input from the Vice Chancellors of Administration, depending on how many people they included, and they still only had one response list per campus. And these are the top 10 risks that were identified in terms of most likely to occur and with the biggest impact. And I'm sure it's not a shock to anybody to see that catastrophic natural event like an earthquake or a fire ranks at the top of the list. These are absolutely, they have the potential to cause enormous damage, and they're pretty much certain to occur. We just don't know when, but we are going to experience an earthquake. We are going to experience a fire. Other ones that were included as the highest impact and likelihood include personnel issues or workplace violence, deferred maintenance, budget impairment, laboratory safety, threats to the safety of researchers, general safety and security both on and off campus, inadequate lab processes and practices for the promotion of environmental health and safety, domestic terrorism including animal rights activists, eco-terrorists, stem cell research opponents, etc., and also student mental health.
You're so good to let people talk, but there was something in the LA Times yesterday about South Korea has a place called Exam Village where people just go there and they just like 20,000 people where they're trying to study to pass different exams and the mental health issues of that kind of pressure. So I'm glad we don't have that here, the Exam Village scenario. But mental health is a problem for students. I mean, I know how I've always been. But anyway, good finding. Sorry, I won't say anything more.
No, please. We're hoping that this is interactive. Nobody likes to listen to me talk for too long. So, but we do want to share the results of this assessment and get your feedback on how we can continue to guide these going forward. Let's see here. So keep in mind that when we're looking at these risks, these top 10 risks, they're only taking into consideration what the impact and likelihood is of these risks occurring. And I do see a comment from UC Riverside here, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But this list of risks does not take into consideration what the effectiveness is of the current controls that we have in place. So yes, catastrophic natural event may be huge impact, huge likelihood, but we have good programs in place in terms of our disaster preparedness, in terms of our seismic retrofit activities, in terms of the different things that we're doing to help manage these risks. So I see a comment here from Tom Willett. It says the data gathered at the department level by UC Riverside was pulled together by Steve Lashir, and he really did a good job of providing feedback and making sure that all the departments were involved and funneling it up to the SMG. So yes, it was one of those iterative processes involving the departments with the data input. So thanks, Tim, for providing that insight. So taking into consideration what our current controls in place are, the Vice Chancellors of Administration agreed that most of the risks that we identified were adequately controlled. But the following 6 risks, overall from a system-wide perspective, were rated as potentially under controlled. And these are rated in order of intensity, if you will, and I'm sure it's not a shock to folks that deferred maintenance is at the top of the list, followed closely by budget impairment, and those two do tend to go together. In addition, equipment and facility malfunction was identified as something that was potentially under controlled. Increases in energy costs, obsolescence of systems and technology, and employee recruitment and retention were the 6 risks that were identified as being potentially under controlled. So these are the areas that we may want to provide additional focus on, and I'll revisit this a little bit later in the presentation. Another thing when we're doing a system-wide risk assessment is we also have to recognize how different our various campuses are. We have campuses with medical centers and those without. We have campuses that have large research expenditures and those with not as much but still doing a lot of research and different activities. And we have campuses with large student populations and small student populations. So we wanted to take a look and see about how their top risks differed depending on the type of campus that we were looking at. And so first of all, let's take a look at research expenditures. So these are the top 10 risks for all the different campuses, with comparing campuses with larger research expenditures, or those that have 10% or more of system-wide research spending, and those with 10% or less. And you'll see that there's 3 stars on each side. These are the only risks that were not common between the two lists of risks. So both campuses that have large research expenditures and relatively smaller research expenditures all agreed that catastrophic natural event, budget impairment, deferred maintenance, personnel issues, threats to the safety of researchers, inadequate lab practices for the promotion of environmental health and safety, and the general safety and security of both on and off campus were common across the entire system. The things that were slightly different were the campuses that have larger research expenditures also included equipment or facility malfunction, acts of intolerance, or disclosure of confidential information in their top risks. In terms of the campuses with smaller research expenditures, they identified laboratory safety, domestic terrorism, and student mental health in their top risks. And that makes sense, right? That seems to be in line with what we would anticipate with those different types of campuses. Any questions so far? Any comments on this?
Hi, Lisanne.
Hi.
This is Hans Gut at Berkeley.
Hi, Hans. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Lisanne?
Good, good. Just fighting the good fight.
Hey, just a comment, thinking about these risks is, in terms of ranking them, I think what's really important at the front end is to identify what the objectives are, for the campuses, for the system. And then you can start to evaluate these different kind of risks in terms of which are the more important to concern yourself with in terms of applying resources. And so if you consider the top goals for the system, or objectives, which are, of course, teaching, research,
public service.
If you look at teaching and research, and you ask yourself, what are the risks that could impair those objectives? What you find is that a lot of these risks, while important and something you want to concern yourself with and control, there are very few that can seriously impact those two objectives. So for example, the catastrophic natural event, in my mind, always rises to the top, because if you knock your buildings down, you can't teach and you can't do research. So that's pretty fundamental.
Right.
If you have huge findings in your A133 audit and you're put on administrative probation by the federal government, you seriously impinge on your ability to do research, and that objective becomes at risk. And if you look for, so those two, in my mind, kind of rise to the top in a sort of a broad brush risk assessment. If you further consider, for example, campus violence, where you have a Virginia Tech kind of a situation, while terrible and something obviously you want to protect against and put controls in place, what you find is that kind of event doesn't, it's not even in the midterm, but in the short term, yes, but in the midterm and long term, it doesn't fundamentally impact your mission of research and teaching, because you get back to business fairly quickly.
Absolutely.
Although you may want to look at reputation risk.
Right.
Is that a safe campus? Do I want to send my kids there? That affects your ability to, your strategic risks of being one of the top universities in the world, and so on. So in summary, my comment is we can never forget fundamentally that every risk assessment begins with a set of objectives that you define, and then you line up your risks against those objectives and you rank them, because there are finite resources available, and you need to, and so one of the wonderful things about ERM and risk assessments is it identifies where to apply your resources.
Exactly, and I'm very glad to hear you bring that up, and we're going to circle back to that a little bit later in the presentation, because we're not necessarily saying that you're absolutely right. We need to start with an objective-based risk assessment and managing those risks that will impair our ability to achieve our specific objectives, or else we could just be wasting money on things that may not, like you say, though these events may be terrible, they may not actually prevent us from achieving our overall mission of teaching, research, and public service.
And I'd love to hear if others on the phone disagree with what I just said or can add some color commentary. Okay, hearing no objection. Okay, I'm going to go back on mute here.
Okay, so we'll continue to go through the results, but we are going to circle back to not only what we're hoping to use the results of this risk assessment for, but also talk about how it fits in and varies from objective-based risk assessment. So I'm glad that you brought up that point, but we'll circle back to it a little bit later in the presentation. So another differentiating factor of our different UCs is that some of them have medical centers and some of them don't. And so this is a comparison of the top 10 risks for medical centers as compared to those without. And again, you'll see that 7 out of the 10 top risks were common, regardless of whether they had a medical center or not. The ones that were unique for the campuses with medical centers includes the equipment and facility malfunction, the acts of intolerance, and disclosure of confidential information. Very similar to the concerns for those with large research expenditures that we discussed on the previous slide. In terms of campuses without medical centers, they're really focused on, the ones that were unique to them include personnel issues or workplace violence, domestic terrorism, or improper governmental activities. And getting back to Hans's comment, I think that these are some of the ones that would, especially improper governmental activities leading to fraud or embezzlement, those are things that could definitely impair our reputational risk as well as get in the way of our ability to achieve our strategic objectives, especially if it was a finding on an A133 audit.
Except that, this is Barbara at Berkeley, except that it could be that the medical centers need to worry about Medi-Cal, Medicare billing.
Right, totally different types of compliance, but the same requirements. So it's just that from their perspective, that didn't hit their top 10 is the only difference. But that's a good clarification, Barbara. Any other comments on this before I move on to the student population one? Hearing none, I will move forward. So in terms of student population, there is a little bit more differentiation between these. And we're looking at campuses that have 25,000 or more students or 25,000 or less students. And so of these, 6 out of the 10 risks were common, including a catastrophic natural event, personnel issues, laboratory safety, deferred maintenance, threats to safety of researchers, general safety and security, both on and off campus, and that is it. The ones that were unique to the campuses that had large student populations was related to inadequate lab processes and practices, disclosure of confidential information, acts of intolerance, and patient care. In terms of campuses with less than 25,000 students, budget impairment ranked at the very top, and then domestic terrorism, student mental health, and increases in energy costs round out the bottom of their top 10. So in conclusion for these surveys, even though the different campuses are unique and they vary in terms of their academic emphasis and their overall environment, there's a lot of similarities between the ways that each of the Vice Chancellors of Administration rated each risk. And because of that, we're better able to develop focused programs on a system-wide basis to help address those common issues. And so the slides that we've discussed up to now are really focused on what the impact and likelihood are of these different risks occurring at each campus. One of the things that we also want to think about are what the current controls are for these common risks, because you can't just look at what the risk is on its own. You need to look at it in context of your current control structure. And if you can determine whether your controls are sufficient or whether you may need additional activities and services to help bring those risks within your risk appetite. And I know that John Gregg is on the call and he's going to say, you're using a lot of jargon, Lisanne, but the basic idea is to take a look at these risks, figure out what we're doing okay at, and figure out what else needs work. And so we tried to take a look at that from a risk services perspective and see, for these top 44 risks, what are some of the common mitigation activities that we have in place? And so we did a review of that, and we pulled that together and documented them in Bulletin number 12. And so this is what Bulletin number 12 looks like, and it's available on the UC ERM website under the Resources tab with the bulletins. And I know that this is tall, this is itty-bitty and tiny and difficult to read, but you'll see the common risks listed on the column on the left. And in the middle are examples of our different mitigation activities. And some of these are hyperlinked to web pages either at a system-wide view, or some of them are campus-specific examples of how they're managing this particular risk. And on the right column is where we're tracking that information and how we're measuring and monitoring that information over time. And so this is kind of an interesting tool that you can use to see what activities we may be using to manage risk in the laboratory safety area, for example, and see examples of what other campuses are doing in these different risk areas. So this is one of the things that we did with this list of risks. So I know that we've been making this a little bit iterative and asking people to provide their experience if they were involved with the Vice Chancellor of Administration System-Wide Risk Assessment. But I was wondering if anybody has used either Bulletin number 11 or Bulletin number 12 for any activities on their campus, and if you might want to share your approach.
This is Carrie at UCSB. We had done a previous risk assessment just on our campus. Mm-hmm. So when we did our current years, we took into account the VCA assessment, and we didn't actually change anything, but the wording, I think, a little bit, like budget impairment, other than insufficient funding. Right. But it just confirmed that what we see as our biggest risks are pretty much what a lot of other people see.
Okay, so you did find that the list of risks was consistent with what you came up with independently at UCSB.
Yeah, there was a little bit of as to how they were ranked, but generally the top 10 were on our list.
Oh, great. Excellent. Did anybody else take a look at that risk assessment or using it for any different types of purposes?
This is Carol from Merced. Hi, Lisanne.
Hi, Carol.
Hi. We are currently, our enterprise risk management currently meeting and doing risk assessments, and I presented them with both the list of sample risks and also with the VCA risk assessment just to generate conversation and to have a place to begin as we began to assess our risks here at Merced. And yes, I found it very helpful. And it was interesting that on our campus, even though the VCA had listed catastrophic natural event as the top risk, both on our campus and system-wide, down at the subject matter expert level, which is where our ERM panel resides, there was really strong objection to that. Mm-hmm. And it actually wound up, I think, not even being considered as one of our top risks, and that's simply because of where we're located. Probably the most catastrophic natural event that we have ever had here would be maybe a wind or a rain or a fog event. Mm-hmm. We really don't have the type of earthquake and fire danger that other locations may experience. So it was interesting, and it was very helpful in terms of launching our conversation.
Excellent. And I'm glad that you bring up the point where a lot of times one of the best benefits of a risk assessment tool is to talk about risks with a lot of different people and identify those where there's a large amount of disagreement in terms of whether a risk is a large impact, large likelihood, or not. And then working through that as a group to figure out what makes the most sense for your specific institution. That's an excellent example. Thanks, Carol. Anybody else, or any suggestions on how we may want to modify this approach in the future? Do you think that we need to cast a wider net? Do you think that we need to consider different types of risks?
Yes, you need to include the medical centers. Sorry.
Yes, no problem. I'll work with
It's all
Terry
about me.
No, it's good. So I'll work with Terry to see if we can come up with a similar approach for the medical centers, and maybe we can work together on helping pull that together. Does that make sense?
Thank you. That's perfect.
Okay, good. We don't want you guys to feel left out.
You know, people, whatever you do, it's never enough. So if you've done 10 things, well, why didn't you do 11?
Why didn't you do 11? What
you've done has great, you know, it has the universality of the themes. I mean, anybody with a brain in their head can figure out how to relate it to medical center applications. I just came back from a meeting where they were talking about the rationale for some downtime we had with our systems, the IT system, and they were explaining in very technical jargon as to how different layers work together. But that is, and that's on your list of things that is a potential risk. And I mean, people can extrapolate with a little bit of you know, involving your own mental activities, but it's always so much more fun to be spoon-fed. So just me again. Thank you.
Absolutely. So actually, you know, for those of you that were at Risk Summit, you know that we had a delegation from Sing Health, which is a 9-member hospital system in Singapore that is working with UC to help bring enterprise risk management to their healthcare organization. And they actually took this list of risks as a starting point and then added risks both that are specific to their environment as well as specific to the healthcare organization. And they came up with a list of 65 different risks in 12 different risk categories that do include different healthcare risks. So we know that this list is being leveraged by folks outside of UC, and we're hoping to build on that and see whether we can leverage that to continue to support different risk assessment activities here at UC.
Yes, and I'd like to just take this opportunity to once again commend the Risk Summit for including that as part of the global approach, as well as it's good for us to learn from them, and it's nice that they're willing to share their expertise and pretend that they can learn from us. But I think that takes the idea of global interactions, and instead of just talking about it, it's like executing it. It's actually doing it, which I always think it adds a human side instead of the people over on the other side of the globe. You see people and they're human, and you talk and they have the problems, and I think it's a great learning opportunity, and whoever came up with that idea should be commended.
Excellent. I'm pretty sure that was Grace's idea.
Well, yes, Grace. She's quite a trendsetter.
Yep, she gets a good idea probably once every 15 minutes. I'm good for one a week, and that's about it.
Well, she got better dendrites. That's what I'm always wondering. Like when they were passing out dendrites, I got shortchanged. But anyway, okay, thank you.
Okay, no problem. So in addition, risk assessments are kind of an ongoing activity. You know, it's not something that we want to do just once annually or once every 6 months. And so, you know us, we really like to help provide tools for every job. And so we took this list of system-wide or common risks to higher education, and we put them into a risk assessment tool where if you'd like to take a look at that at your specific department or your specific campus, that those risks are pre-populated in a tool to help you identify what the impact and the likelihood is and what your current control effectiveness is. In addition, we also have a fairly new tool, and I think John Gregg did a webinar on this, if not last month, the month before, and it basically gives you the ability to identify all of your risks, identify what your impact and likelihood are for those risks, identify what your current controls are, but then not only figuring out what your current as-is state is, but based on what you're currently doing to manage and mitigate those risks, and figuring out, well, based on our impact and our likelihood and our estimated control effectiveness, this risk is still potentially under controlled. What additional activities do we need to do? And what impact do we think that will have on our overall control effectiveness? And so these are just 2 tools available to help continue to support your risk assessment activities on an ongoing basis. So circling back to, sure, I was just going to circle back to you anyways, Hans.
Yeah, the higher education risk assessment tool, is that just based on your UC system surveys, or does that include your broader net that you cast it out to other universities and so on?
It includes the broader net that we passed out to other universities. So it includes that list of 44 risks that was identified in Bulletin number 11.
Cool. Okay. In terms of responding to your previous slide about any thoughts about it, a modification to the approach and so on, one thing that well, first of all, let me say I think it's fantastic what you've put together here, because a lot of really smart people at other universities here in the UC system have really put a lot of thought into this stuff, and we should all benefit from that. We shouldn't have to recreate that, rebuild that knowledge. And it works to sort of jumpstart a project on campus to do an ERM assessment, because it gives you the ability to go to people, to associate vice chancellors, and say, hey, here's a starting list of risks. How do you respond to this? Do you see your risk on here? And that's great, because I think a lot of people have survey fatigue. They don't want to start from scratch and build up the information, so we can go to them. But I think, if I were to do a comprehensive ERM assessment of, say, the Berkeley campus, I would certainly start with what you have here without question. But one thing I would also personally want to do would be to go to all those different university websites, Texas A&M, University of Washington, and whatever others are out there, and see firsthand what they came up with and how they came up with it. And so on that note, I don't know if you would find that valuable, and I guess what I want to say is it'd be great if you had some links on the UCOP website that said, hey, you want to see how this institution's doing their stuff, go here. Or even create second-hand original lists of our own of, hey, here's what so-and-so came up with, here's their risks. So that's just a thought, because I would want to do that anyway, just to see discreetly how a specific university went about it.
Absolutely.
As opposed to a sort of a consolidated, all thrown in one pot kind of list, which is good also.
Right. So it's
so
what you're saying.
Go on.
I was just wanted to clarify to make sure that I understood what you're saying. Is it's one thing to say, yes, we're managing, contract and grant risks. But it's another thing to say, this is the policies that we put in place. This is how we attacked it. This is what we figured out what the vulnerabilities were. And so actually how they solved it, so we can compare and contrast it. Is that what you're saying, Hans?
Yeah, I think that's one way of saying it. It's basically just what have they done that I can benefit from that I haven't even thought about. And I was looking at Texas A&M's website yesterday. They've got a whole set of tools on there for doing impact analyses, likelihood. It's just there's a lot of cool stuff out there. And,
absolutely.
And I guess I would like to see UCOP as a one-stop shopping for, hey, here's state-of-the-art stuff. Here's what your peers are doing. Here's kind of everything.
Okay.
Just a thought.
Okay. No, that's excellent. We'll take a look at seeing how we can approach that.
So this is Barbara. I'm hearing Hans say that he can do the work of going to the different links if he knew where to go.
Right, and so what we would have to do is try to find what the links were that would provide that beneficial information, and then make them available to everybody. So you could say, hey, if you're looking for some cool things on impact analysis, here's what Texas A&M is doing. Here's what UC is doing. Here's something that University of Colorado is doing.
The same research. And if
Absolutely.
we found something cool, we could maybe send it to OP, who could, and you guys could put it up, and that way we could share it across the system.
That's a great idea. So if any of you have come across a tool or a cool approach or a cool program that you think would be useful and helpful information to the rest of the UC family, if you can either send it to me or you can send it to the Enterprise Risk Management ERM at ucop.edu mailbox, And we can work to consolidate that and put together a very similar bulletin that shows resources from other institutions of how we're tackling these various risk issues. So feel free to send them our way, and we'll try to pull something together for you.
You know, and on that note, Lisanne, this is Hans again. You know, we can start with our own shop. I mean, how about links to what other campuses are doing?
And that's kind of what bulletin number 12 does. And so let me go back to that slide here. And so on the website for bulletin number 12, and it's a Word document because the version of Adobe that we had didn't incorporate links as well. So it's a Word document. And some of these Word documents are hyperlinks to either campus programs or system-wide programs. So it includes Be Smart About Safety as an example of one of the specific programs we have in place for laboratory safety. Let me pull up the full bulletin here and give you some other examples aside from just the screenshot that we have.
Have we switched from risk assessment methodology to risk management methodology here?
What does that mean exactly?
Good question. Don't they sort of, isn't there a lot of overlap?
Well, it's part of the same process. And so you don't want to just do a risk assessment and then not do anything with it. It's part of continuing that
executing
process.
These theories. That's the thing. Everybody gets so wrapped up in conceptualizing, and then they'll make models, and they talk, forever about all the ramifications, implications. But actually executing it, that's where things fall apart. Starting with me, of course. But still, I think taking these things and actually using them, that's where there's an overlap. But you need to move beyond, because otherwise you get a lot of pretty pictures and ideas, but nothing to do with them. So I think that they're both important. So. And
they all fall into that enterprise risk management framework. Risk assessment is a very important point and component of the enterprise risk management framework, but it's only one component. You still need to identify what we're going to do about those risks. Are we going to accept them? Are we going to control them? Are we going to divest them and discontinue it and avoid that risk? And then whatever we choose to take on as part of achieving our mission of teaching, research, and public service, what controls and activities do we need to put in place to manage that risk? So they go hand in hand in terms of both managing and mitigating. So bulletin number 12 shows examples of what the campus community is doing to mitigate these various common risks. And it's not put forth as a comprehensive list. It's only there as an example. But this is something that we can do and take it one step further based on Hans and Barbara's suggestion to identify what other campuses are doing or other universities are doing in these different areas and trying to find different tools and best practices and making UC a central repository for those different activities.
Lisanne, this is Carol in Merced again.
Hello.
And I found Hans's suggestion is extremely good. And here's what I found when I started doing a lot of research on the enterprise risk management. UC at the system level has a lot of excellent tools and information. At the campus level, I found little to nothing beyond maybe one web page with a paragraph, and my campus included in that comment. So I would have found it helpful to be able to go to other UC campuses and see what they were doing at the campus level. Mm-hmm. I did find outside the system, I found that type of help. I found excellent help with Washington State.
Absolutely.
And with Maricopa County. Their Maricopa Integrated Risk Assessment, they had that type of information. But it would still be helpful to see how the individual campuses are taking enterprise risk management on their campus. And one thing that we do struggle with on our campus, as the person from the medical center mentioned, is I think it feels like we're all sort of walking in the dark, like this is our maiden voyage on ERM, and we're doing the risk assessments, but nobody is entirely sure what to do with them once we have them and who owns it, and it's just a little bit difficult.
Absolutely. I totally understand. And what I'm hearing a little bit, and John, Greg, are you still on the call?
Yes, I am.
I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on how the ERM maturity work plans and the content that's collected in those helps feed and continue the framework cycle in terms of identifying what the risks are, identifying what programs, how they line up with the framework, and then using that to guide future activities. It doesn't necessarily meet all of what Carol's asking in terms of figuring out who's responsible for different activities and areas, but it does talk a little bit about it does give some insight into what the different campuses are doing in different risk areas and what programs are putting in place. So can you comment a little bit on that, John?
Well, when you look at, this really comes back to the COSO framework too, that once you do a risk assessment and you've identified the additional actions, that's really what it gets down to, those additional actions that you want to take that you feel are necessary to bring risks to the proper level. And by that I mean you're either going to bring down high risks or you're going to take away from low risks to redeploy resources. This is where your work group really becomes an essential focal point, and to bring the information back to the work group to say, okay, we've done this risk assessment. Here are the changes that have come out of it, and then that should drive a work plan, which you can probably want to go deeper than the ERM maturity work plan. You might keep that at a higher level, but subordinate to that, you may have a specific plan to move into a particular area and say, okay, we want to take these actions. And then you'll take the actions that you do and bring that information back to your work group. So in using the work plan as a driver and subordinate plans, it helps to keep activities going within your work groups. And so when you bring a topic up in the work group, it's a good idea within the agenda to actually state what is the action item that is associated with this particular topic. So maybe at the first time we've done the risk assessment, we've identified these additional things. We need to have effect the change. We're going to contact whoever is the process owner or the risk owner to say, okay, and hopefully you've worked with the risk owner throughout the process to now let's move forward and let's take the actions that we need and then keep the work group informed. Keep coming back to the work group as you meet to say, okay, we've started this actions, here's what's happening, and update the group and use that subordinate plan as kind of the detail list of the specific actions you're taking. And then that, of course, would then feed your maturity work plan as far as your overall picture. But it really is, what it really is about is when you think about ERM, enterprise risk management, that's typically management, is where the process starts to break down. You have to manage the risk, which means taking action, which means engaging other people, which may mean seeking additional resources, whether it's putting in new systems, adjusting processes. And then also, too, I think it's very important in the risk assessment process is to think about your key performance and risk indicators and get those metrics going and report back on those so you can show change. So it's really a management effort, and that's where your work group is really essential to that process.
And Carol, if there's any support that we can provide, either in terms of meeting facilitation or any types of tools or guidance, feel free to reach out to us. We're here to help in any way that we can to help keep you moving forward and help make sure that you have the resources that in terms of helping to figure out what comes next and helping with your ERM program. So we're here to help. So just feel free to reach out, and that goes to anybody, not just Carol. So
great, thank you.
No problem.
And John Gregg has already been invaluable, but you'll definitely be hearing from me too, Lisanne.
Great, thank you.
Call us at any time.
This is Carrie from UCSB. I have an example that may be of use for Carol and maybe others. So what we've done with our top 14 risks that we've decided that the residual risk is the highest is that the group has decided that we've kind of broken through that barrier of what does ERM do, and so now the group is kind of cohesive and they understand that collectively they're supposed to manage, the bigger campus risks. And so all of these risks on our list are obviously already being managed by somebody at some level. So what they've decided to do is to take those top risks and just ask for a one-page report so they can educate themselves on, well, what are the management actions that's happening by that control point, like, the IT group or the lab safety committee, those kind of people. And then we're also going to do conversations, like everybody's going to give a 20-minute presentation on what their area of risk is. Like student affairs is going to give a presentation, IT is going to give a presentation, so that we can all become better informed as a group to take better collective responsibility for managing the risks campus-wide and break us out of those silos. Does that make sense?
I think that sounds like a great idea. So what I'm hearing is that there may be some interest in doing something a little bit different from the benchmarking study, but maybe, doing something different from the ERM maturity work plan, but doing something like an enterprise risk management benchmarking study between the different UC campuses to see how each of the different ERM panels or ERM work groups are approaching risks and how they triage and prioritize and how they manage it on an ongoing basis. Is there any interest out there for something along those lines?
Absolutely. Hans here. Yep.
Yes.
Anybody opposed?
Not opposed. Always interested.
Yeah, it's always good to see how other campuses are managing their ERM risks.
And it's more on the mechanical basis. I mean, I think we have an understanding of the risks and we have an understanding of some of the other things, but how they actually approach it and how they organize and I think that would be beneficial. So if you folks are open, we'll try to put something together. We'll pass it by Grace and see what the best approach is.
This is Carol again. I have a question kind of for the group as a whole. I have no idea who's on the phone or what campuses. But I'm wondering if our campus is alone in being unable to engage the academic side on this effort.
Well, we report up to the Executive Vice Chancellor, but most of the people in the ERM work group, we've got business officers and we've got assistant deans, but we don't have actual faculty on our ERM work group.
Okay, well, our ERM work group consists pretty much exclusively the administrators. We have no deans or assistant deans or student affairs or any either administrator on the academic side or any faculty person. And has anyone successfully been able to engage them in the ERM process, and how did you do it?
We're heading that way at Davis now. We are bringing more faculty members to our group, along with student affairs. And typically what, in my experience, I've found is that you're really not going to get into the academic issues themselves, things like teaching loads and that kind of thing, and curriculum. That's their purview. But what helps most is to approach it from the standpoint, we're here to foster and support what you're doing. So we would value your input as to the things that we're doing to make it possible for you to do the teaching and the research. So we don't want to get into the specifics of what they're doing, but more how we help you get there.
This is Barbara at Berkeley. We haven't had success yet, but since my office has moved out of administration directly into the Chancellor's office, we're hoping that we'll have much better success going forward.
And at Davis, in a similar way, our work group is reporting up to the Chancellor's committee. So that's been a big change, where before we were down at the Vice Chancellor administration level. So again, that's going to help.
Okay. So I know that we're nearing the end of our call here. It's 10:57 right now. I think that it sounds like there's some good support in terms of doing a type of benchmarking study, and that we'll figure out the best way to approach that on our end and continue to move that forward. Are there any other comments in terms of the system-wide risk assessment or moving forward, or any other comments or questions?
No, I just think it's very exemplary that you provide this opportunity, although I don't always understand everything. It gives something to like reflect on. You talk about critical reflexivity and all the stuff you should reflect on at the end of the day. This gives food for thought, and I think it helps sort of people to get new ideas and fresh perspectives on possible solutions to enduring challenges. And that's what the whole idea of all this is, trying to find better ways to do what we do. So,
exactly.
And I like that little picture there. That makes everybody feel comfortable. Who'd be upset if they're asking a question and look like her? She's cute. So anyway, I hope you don't find it overwhelming.
No, absolutely. I think that the more interaction and the more feedback that we can get, the better we can support you folks, and that's what our goal is.
Oh, that sounds like what we say when we go out and try to get people to ask questions. Say, seeking guidance is a sign of wisdom, not weakness. You're saying all this stuff. My goodness, it sounds good when it's coming out. Okay, so hopefully, okay, thank you. It's very nice to be on the other side, the receiving end here.
Well, excellent.
We're also available if you just want to call us and talk.
That's a dangerous invitation.
We're available for consultations and conversations.
Oh, wow. You are an intrepid soul.
3255.
Going to provide the number. Oh, my goodness. Oh, let me be quiet.
530 752 3255. I'm John, Greg. And of course, here's Lisanne on the screen.
Got it. Thank you.
My contact information is on the screen, and also you can always shoot an email to the erm@ucop.edu mailbox, and we'll triage that internal to our team and make sure that your inquiry gets to the right folks. So with that, if there's no other questions or if anything else, we'll stay on for a couple more minutes.
I have a real quick question.
Sure, please.
I like the way that VCA assessment is broken down in those PowerPoint slides. Could you maybe pass those on so I could share that with our ERM work group?
Sure, and I'm sorry, I missed who was talking there.
Oh, sorry, this is Carrie from UC Santa Barbara.
Okay, sure.
Thanks.
No problem. Anybody else want the slides?
Oh, sure. It's always nice, but I hesitate to ask for everything because eventually if you keep asking, eventually people are going to say no. So I try to, choose my questions carefully, but that's very generous of you.
So maybe for everybody that wants a copy of the slides, could you just shoot me a brief email and I'll send it out to you?
That's fair. Thank you.
Then you could just send it, you can send it to the Risk Leadership listserv, and then anybody not on the list could shoot you the email. You'd get less.
Emily, are you still on the line?
Yes.
I know you're there. Can we just send it out to the folks that participated? Do you have that information?
Yes, I can have it sent out a follow-up to anybody who logged in with their own email address. So if there's anyone who didn't log in with their email address, it does. It does.
Yes, indeed. Oh, I'm so glad.
Okay, so we'll do that. So I'll make sure that Emily has the presentation and we can send it out to the folks that logged in. Thanks for your help, Emily.
Certainly.
Okay, so with that, I guess we'll go ahead and close the call. And if you have any other questions, feel free to shoot us an email, contact us, wave your hands frantically, and we'll be there to help you out.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
John, enjoyed this.
Oh, good.
Bye-bye now.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of the week.
Thanks everybody.